Well, hello, and blessings to you all. Well, here we are, pseudo-quarantined to our houses or our places of work. Well, for some of us anyway, amidst this COVID-19 coronavirus crisis. Restaurants are closed, public gatherings are curtailed, large events postponed or canceled. Obviously, I don't think there isn't a soul out there in the world right now that hasn't found this whole thing to be incredibly disruptive to our daily lives. Plus, despite the seriousness of this pandemic, I think the mainstream media has made it worse, and has developed headlong into a hysteria, and it's cultivating kind of a culture of fear in our country. Again, not to downplay the seriousness of this at all, because obviously folks have died or passed away as a result of coronavirus, and there's still a lot we don't know about it. But I think we've lost our way a little bit, lost a little bit of prudence in dealing with this crisis. But what's obviously more incredibly unfortunate, and part of the reason why I'm doing this video today for the community, is about this whole thing is messing up our daily lives and lives as members of the church, essentially with masses being canceled during the holiest time of the year in the church, this penitential season of Lent. Reception of the sacraments have been curtailed. We're talking about First Communion, Confirmation, Holy Week, the Triduum. All those things are being postponed right now, and that's obviously unsettling and not a good thing in the economy of grace, especially when we're dealing with the salvation of souls. It's not good. But what I want to do tonight is offer in this video is offer some hope and a spiritual, theological reflection, a path forward in this crisis. As Christians, we are a people of hope, and we should be offering peace amidst the hysteria. We should be offering calm. We should be offering people consolation and strength and comfort. As Christians, we should not be so easily roped up in all the hysteria that everybody else seems to be kind of falling into right now. So for those of you that know me, I run the Theology on Tap program for the St. Michael's Catholic community in Fort Bragg. I'm also a catechist for teenagers, young adults, adults. So again, what I'm offering in this video is a quick Lenten Theology on Tap that directly addresses how Catholics, particularly our community, can view this crisis through the lens of the Church's history and her deep theological tradition. So really over the next kind of 20 or 30 minutes, I plan to briefly address a couple things. First is kind of a reflection on just how church history during other epidemics, pandemics, or other instances where Christians did not have access to the sacraments for a long time. A lot of great examples of that. So I'm going to share a couple of those with you this evening, and really even just how the early church addressed the reception of the sacraments. So a couple reflections and notes there. Very briefly, I'll also secondarily touch upon just the problem of evil. People faced with natural evil, diseases, pandemics, begin to question why, especially when it affects us closely, like our family members, friends, other close associates. People just naturally ask the question, why is this happening? If you're a person of faith, you say, why is God allowing this to happen? So just a really quick, short reflection on the problem of evil. We'll just kind of delve into some Aquinas there. And third, just given those previous 2 points, is what are some things we can do if we can't go to Mass during this Lenten and then subsequent Easter season? I think some of you are kind of already know the answer to that question. But the answer to that question will then segue nicely into my fourth point, which is the theology behind a spiritual communion. Kind of delve a little bit into that, some examples of the saints. Again, getting into the theology of Aquinas to address this question. So again, this is not going to be a super involved theology session, but more examples from history, the lives of the saints, and a little bit of theology, particularly some Aquinas here, to really help us understand this crisis we're in right now, but then just kind of give us some peace, a way forward amidst the confusion and hysteria, and then they also offer that to others, given the parameters that we're in right now. Of course, I'm recording a video in order to do this because of all the challenges posed with social distancing. But again, I'm going to try and wrap that all up for you. Just something for you guys to kind of chew on a little bit. And then at the end of my topic here, there's some more practical things for maybe hosting theology on taps via the internet, meetings, webinars, something that will make it more readily access to everybody, given the situation that we're in right now. So the first part, how did church history and the history of the church, in light of epidemics and pandemics and other instances where Christians did not have access to the sacraments for a long time, how did they deal with that? First, let me just give you just a really brief synopsis on how the early church, ancient church, medieval church dealt with the reception of the sacraments. Different than we do now, obviously. If you were a Catholic Christian in the 13th century, you only received communion maybe once, maybe twice a year. There wasn't a readily frequent access to Holy Communion. Everybody went to Mass, of course, but not everybody received communion at every Mass. Certainly not at daily Mass, definitely not on Sundays. But people still went to Mass to at least give the holy gaze during the consecration, to at least see God incarnate in the species of the body and the blood. To see that was a grace in and of itself. And part of that, again, I'll address that more in the spiritual communion piece. But again, in the middle of a church, people frequented confession way more than they did, Holy Communion. Today it's the reverse. People frequent communion all the time, but confession lines are super short or non-existent. That's unfortunate. But again, it's a very different paradigm than we do right now. And of course, the medieval church had great devotions. There was great piety and fervor for the sacraments, even if they weren't always receiving it. There was great love and devotion and piety there. Of course, in the medieval church, 14th century, posed this tremendous problem known as the Black Death. But even before that, centuries before in Rome, there was plagues, there was famine, in really different parts of Europe and the Middle East when the early church was kind of growing out of that early apostolic tradition. And people just carried on. They carried on. And it wasn't like less masses were said, more masses were said. In fact, one of the ways that people addressed famine and plague was to go out and do penitential processions, like during the streets of Rome. St. Gregory the Great led one in Rome when plague struck the city of Rome in the 6th century. It's a great story there. I won't share it all today, but look it up if you get the chance. So people did more devotions, did more piety. You wouldn't see masses being canceled. You know, science wasn't as great as it is today to kind of identify and record transmission of different diseases that were out there. But certainly people took precautions, but there wasn't a hysteria or an overly cautious approach to these things, but certainly taking a greater piety and turning their trust in God to help them through there. Of course, people identified some of these natural evils with sin, infidelity. Just look at the history of ancient Israel, how they viewed a lot of the things that happened to them, a lot of it because of their unfaithfulness, the turning away from God. And Christians in the early church viewed it the same way. They viewed that maybe they got lax in their spiritual practices, and the alternative to help solve that was to ratchet it up, was to increase devotion, increase piety, increase penitence, and not less, and not kind of run away from it. So again, a different paradigm that we're facing today. I'm not going to give too much comment or criticism on that, but just recognize there's a different time, a different way of addressing it. A more recent memory, really almost a little over a century ago. People have heard about this. Probably if you've been reading the stories about coronavirus, COVID-19, and comparisons to other pandemics that affected the world. You know, Spanish flu of 1917, 1918, it affected 1/3 of the globe. It killed, I think, 7 million people globally. It even killed 3 of the children of Fatima. 2 of the 3 were killed by the Spanish flu in 1918. And so again, I'm not going to delve too much into that, the story there. A lot of you, I think, know the story of Fatima, but they were affected by it, obviously profoundly. But during that time, obviously governments and the church took precautions to stop the spread of the Spanish flu because it was so incredibly lethal. We didn't have the same access to vaccines that we do now. So it was a very, very challenging time. And church doors were closed, masses were canceled, but it did not stop people's piety and devotion. Not everybody, obviously, just like today, liked the fact that masses were canceled, church doors were closed. But there certainly were, brave priests, holy priests, brave men and women that did not stop practicing charity in that time. Visiting the sick, caring for people that were affected with the flu. Of course, many of them contracted it as a result of that. That self-sacrifice for their neighbor. So, there's obviously some comparisons there between the Spanish flu and now. Spanish flu being obviously much more lethal. We don't know how lethal the coronavirus is going to be at this point, but it has killed a lot of people so far. So there are some comparisons there, and we can see lack of access to liturgy in that situation over a century ago. I already addressed, just kind of access to the, in the medieval church, that Christians did not have readily access to the sacraments. One great example that came to mind is thinking about this reflection here is of the faithful that did not have access to the sacraments for a long time was the Japanese Catholics in the 17th century. After the first conversions that happened as a result there by the Jesuits going on their missions in the 16th century. Once the Japanese government became hostile to what they saw as foreign colonization and invasion, kind of a very hostile reaction to Christianity, Catholicism, and so it was very difficult for priests to get into Japan, and really what the Japanese Catholics had for decades, a better part over a century, was baptism, baptism by desire, and a life of prayer and faithfulness and charity. That's all they had. So think about that, and just think about obviously all those martyrs, the martyrs of Nagasaki and others that witnessed to the faith without access to the Mass, confession, the Eucharist, confirmation, and they still led holy lives, and they still kept to the faith even in the midst of persecution. So, even during Lent, there's great traditions during Lent where St. Francis didn't go to one Mass during the Lenten season. Kind of like a fasting from the Eucharist as a means to prepare himself in a real, deeper way. You have tons of examples of this in the early church. Maybe in a future video, if we continue to do this, I'll share other examples, maybe deeper stories of how people fasted from communion. And I'll touch on a good example that Benedict shared in one of his books. We'll talk about that. But again, just understand there's been many times in the church's history where we've not had access to the liturgy, the Mass, the sacraments, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. Access has been limited, but sometimes there's a good reason. There's good that can come out of it, and that's what I'm going to touch on right now. And it's this problem of evil, and this is kind of my second part. And again, I'm not going to delve too much. I mean, again, we've done a whole Theology on Tap on this in the past. Maybe we do it again. Maybe do another separate video, webinar on the whole problem of evil. But I'm just going to touch on briefly tonight. I'm going to get into Aquinas here. And pull out the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas, really the gold standard in Catholic theology. This is my copy here, done by the English Dominicans in the 1940s. Great copy. You don't need a kind of fancy copy like this to read the Summa. If you just go to newadvent.com, the whole Summa is free. I like kind of tangible representations because I'm one of those people that just like to draw and underline and comment in the margins. That's me. But just, again, touching on this problem of evil and natural evil. In St. Thomas, the Summa, Part 1, Prima Pars, Part 1, Question 2, Article 3. So super early in this great magnum opus of theology by St. Thomas here. And the third article asks the question is whether God exists. All right? And Objection 1, for some of you that probably are not familiar with St. Thomas, the Summa is an incredibly well-organized scholastic disputation on a whole panoply of questions. I mean, if you've had a question out there about theology, about the faith, St. Thomas has answered it in some way or fashion. And so usually how the Summa is structured is in the old kind of medieval scholastic disputation format, where St. Thomas, he sets up objections to the question that he's going to answer in his way. So these are not straw man arguments. These are probably questions he heard even in his day in the 13th century. But the question the answer to the question whether God exists, he's going to give answers that he's going to respond to. They're called objections. So usually there's 2 objections, or maybe 2 or 3, maybe even 4 objections to a question. Then he will give what's called a sed contra, where he draws upon the tradition of the church, somebody not him, not his voice speaking, a lot of times from sacred scripture, from other church fathers, from Aquinas. The Summa is a great synthesis of scripture, tradition, the church fathers, and the philosophy that he had access to in his day, Aristotle, the Platonic tradition, a great use of Augustine, but again, a great synthesis of all of that. Thomas was so brilliant in putting that together. But again, after those objections and the sed contra, which is on the contrary, he gives his answer, and then he gives his answers to the objections after his answer. So in the third article, objection 1 says, and I'll read it here, it seems that God does not exist, because if one of 2 contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If, therefore, God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Sound familiar? You've probably heard that today. All the new atheists that are out there on the internet right now. This is typical, this is like the gotcha question, the whole problem of evil. God must not exist because there's evil in the world. Again, I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm just going to give you Thomas's answer. But you've probably heard this question. Thomas's answer in his respondio, his answer is the 5 ways. You've probably heard of the 5 ways. If not, pull up the Summa. Again, I don't think we've done a full Theology on Tap class on the 5 ways. We can. I think it'd be a great class. But I'm not going to dwell on those. I'm just going to hit on his answer, his reply to objection 1. Again, objection 1 says, God cannot exist because evil exists. And if God means infinite goodness, that should be able to destroy or annihilate any evil. Again, the presupposition there is evil is a kind of positive force. Positive not in the good way, but it can exert potency or energy on something. So St. Thomas says, and he draws on St. Augustine. He says, St. Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. Now this is Thomas talking. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. Now, I understand that might ring hollow, particularly if you are one struck close to a natural evil that is occurring in your life, to yourself, to a loved one, friend, family member, close associate. But just dwell on that some more. In God's providence, he sees things completely different than we do in our finite existence. And God has the ability to bring good even out of evil. Just think of the Paschal mystery itself. Think of the crucifixion, the life and the death of Jesus Christ, and how God can bring about the salvation of humanity through an incredibly wicked and violent, bloody act. So again, to kind of give some perspective of the coronavirus, what is the good? Ask yourselves, what is the good that is coming out of this? And that's kind of what I'm going to touch on tonight. There is some good there, I think, in terms of us being quarantined and in our homes, in our limited capacity neighborhoods, maybe the grocery store can, maybe some of those other essential things for the time being. But what are the goods that we can draw out of masses being canceled, especially during this Lenten season? How can we reflect on that? And what are some practical things we can do amidst that to help bring about that good? Again, think back to the good that came out of those previous examples in church history that I provided earlier. First part, and just this is kind of a minor segue here, but I think this is my personal opinion, but again, I think it's shared by quite a few folks out there, but I think many of us have become very kind of complacent when it comes to the reception of the sacraments. So in a real kind of one sense is sometimes absence from the reception can make the heart grow fonder. Absence, distance makes the heart grow fonder. I think there's some truth that rings there. But I'm gonna bring up another book because this is back when Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI was Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, and this is Pilgrim Fellowship of Faith. Great book. It's a series of interviews that he did back when he was the prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, really at the height of his kind of theological game. And so I'm going to read this to you. This is, to me, this is so good. It's part of what he calls a fasting from the sacrament of the Eucharist. And I'm going to read it for you. So hopefully you can kind of stay with me here. I just think there's so many some really rich insights in this that we could, again, help identify those goods. So it is in a chapter called Communion, Eucharist, Fellowship, and Mission. So Ratzinger, obviously Pope Emeritus Benedict Ratzinger at the time, reflecting on the reception of the sacraments in a more fasted way, or our own kind of voluntary stepping away from the reception. Of course, many of us are in an involuntary situation, but again, I think it's applicable here. He touches, again, going back to St. Augustine. Thomas hit Augustine, Ratzinger's, Benedict's doing the same thing. When Augustine felt his death approaching, he excommunicated himself and took upon himself ecclesiastical penitence. In his last days, he set himself alongside, in solidarity, with the public sinners who seek forgiveness and grace through the pain of not receiving communion. He, Augustine, wanted to meet his Lord in the humility of those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. For him, the righteous and gracious one. Against the background of his sermons and writings, which describe the mystery of the Church as a communion with the body of Christ, and as the body of Christ on the base of the Eucharist, in a really marvelous way, this gesture was quite shocking. It seems to me more profound and fitting the more often I ponder it. Do not often we take things too lightly today when we receive the Most Holy Sacrament? I'm going to pause there. Ask yourself that question. Regular Sunday Mass goer, maybe daily Mass goer, do you often take these things too lightly when you go to receive the Most Holy Sacrament? Continue here. Could such a spiritual fasting not sometimes be useful or even necessary to renew and establish more deeply our relation to the body of Christ? He continues, in the early church, there was a most expressive exercise of this kind. Probably since the time of the apostles, Eucharistic fasting on Good Friday was part of the church's spirituality of communion. Of course, what's the one day of the year we don't celebrate Mass in the church? Good Friday. Not receiving communion on one of the most holy days of the church's year, which was celebrated with no Mass, without any communion of the faithful, was a particularly profound way of sharing in the passion of the Lord, the sorrowing of the bride from whom the bridegroom had been taken away. This is Benedict. I think that a Eucharistic fast of this kind, if it were deliberate and experienced as a deprivation, think of our own circumstance right now, could even today be properly significant on certain occasions that would have to be carefully considered, such as days of penitence, Lent, and why not, on instance, for Good Friday, once more. Or also perhaps especially at great public masses when there are so many people that a dignified distribution of the sacrament is often just not possible, so that by not receiving the sacrament, people could truly show more reverence and love than by doing so in a way that contradicts the sublime nature of this event. Again, look back at what I was just talking about with the medieval church. Not frequent reception of Holy Communion. Going back to Benedict here. Such fasting, which could not be allowed to become arbitrary, of course, but would have to be consonant with the spiritual guidance of the Church, could help people toward a deepening of their personal relation to the Lord and the sacrament. It could be an act of solidarity with all those who have a yearning for the sacrament but cannot receive it. It seems to me that the problem of people who have been divorced and remarried, yet equally the problem of intercommunion, mixed marriages for example, would be less of a burden if voluntary spiritual fasting was at the same time undertaken in visible recognition and expression of the fact that we are all dependent upon that healing love which the Lord effected in the ultimate solitude of the cross. I would not, of course, wish to suggest by this a return to some kind of Jansenism. In biological life, as in spiritual life, fasting presumes that eating is the normal thing to do. Yet from time to time, we need a cure for falling into mere habit and its dullness. Sometimes we need to be hungry, need bodily and spiritual hunger, so as once more to comprehend the Lord's gifts and to understand the suffering of our brethren who are hungry. Spiritual hunger, like bodily hunger, can be a vehicle of love. So, that is a book that I had early in just my my theological studies, and I saw it in a blog. Somebody had brought it back up again. I was like, oh my God, I got to go back and revisit that. So I pulled that part out and wanted to share that as part of my my Lenten reflection this evening. So a lot to reflect upon there. But again, if you're curious about the book, again, it's Pilgrim, Fellowship of Faith, Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. Great book, a lot of great, again, theological insights there, particularly those that are applicable to us today. Okay, so what are some other things, given all that, what are some of the things that we can help bring some good out of this time of deprivation, as Benedict puts it? Okay, maybe we can start stepping up our Lenten game. All right, the 3 pillars of fasting, prayer, almsgiving. In the fasting sense, maybe some of us can actually make our fasts a little harder in reparation for the church right now. Again, going back to Benedict, maybe in taking a harder fast from the Eucharist, or maybe just from regular food in general. Again, the fast that we have during Lent in the church right now, frankly, our weak sauce. They are the weak. Fasting really means not putting food into your body. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm not gonna eat chocolate, or I'm gonna fast from Facebook or Twitter or wine or whatever. Okay, those are all good, but fasting, as it was always understood in the church, was always much harder, and it required long periods of not eating food. So maybe instead of just Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, where we do this one meal and a second snack not to exceed 2 meals, to me that's super legalistic. Just so weird. And how are you gonna, everybody's subjective, and how do you really do that? Make it simple. Just don't eat food for a long period of time during the days of Lent as an act of reparation to up the fasting, and tie it, carve out as you fast more from food, drink, whatever, turn that time into more prayer. You know, if you're not working, if you're maybe working from home, spend more time in prayer. I'll touch on that. But again, hitting on the fasting piece, just picked up a great book that I'm working through right now, but it's got some excellent insights. You know, eat, fast, feast, heal your body while feeding your soul, a Christian guide to fasting. Brilliant. Pick it up, read it, easy read. Jay Richards, awesome author. He's a professor at CUA. Yeah, maybe we step up our Lenten game during this time and really do some good old-fashioned fasting, and then see what it does for our spiritual life and really our physical life. Again, folks, we are body soul composites as human persons. We are not, trapped in this body waiting for just our soul to escape at the end of our lives. No, we are our bodies, we are our souls, and they're connected. So our physical health sometimes can also be tied to our spiritual health and vice versa. So when we take upon spiritual practices that are hard, that require physical deprivation, that can be good for us spiritually, and not just in a health sense, a physical sense. I think the science attests, and Richard's book touches on the science and the spiritual nature of fasting. So again, just something to kind of reflect upon there, something good you can do to step it up during this time. Prayer, obviously I mentioned that already. For quarantine, working from home, I don't have a lot of things to do because of the COVID outbreak. Maybe you can start taking up some more, developing some more prayer practices. First one, obviously, maybe some more scripture reading. How about the rest of the time during Lent? You do the daily mass readings. Even if you're not a daily mass goer, just read the daily mass readings. Or maybe practice some Lectio Divina, some divine reading. Read them slowly. Meditate on the words. Listen to what God is trying to tell you in this liturgical season through those particular mass readings. Maybe you pick up the Liturgy of the Hours. If you have the Laudate app, or maybe you've got the 4-volume Psalter, maybe you pick up Liturgy of the Hours. Many Catholics are unfamiliar with that if you're not a priest or religious or a lay religious order. I'm a lay Dominican, so I do the Divine Office, the Liturgy of the Hours. But maybe that's something you could pick up too. And the Church encourages lay people to pick it up. They just don't advertise it or press upon it. Maybe not like they should. It's a great spiritual practice. Rosary, daily rosary. That's something easy that you could pick up during Lent, at least a decade. But you should be praying a whole rosary every day, especially during this time. I don't know if those of you that know, but Pope Francis did a kind of global rosary this past Thursday for the virus, for all those suffering right now, those working in the government, the health industry, doctors, physicians, nurses, people suffering with death and other kinds of deprivations because of the virus. Really the first time in a long time a Pope has called for a kind of global rosary at a specific time and place. So maybe pick up the rosary, maybe doing the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 3 o'clock every day. That's a good spiritual practice you could do to kind of up your Lenten game. I got a couple book recommendations too. Again, some of you might already be doing some great spiritual reading. One thing I'm reading right now: Spiritual Warfare, Sermon of Spirits. Dan Burke, great book. This Tremendous Lover, Boylan, great book. There's all kinds of them that are out there. Okay, what about almsgiving? The third pillar of Lent. Again, more of us gonna have some time on our hands. I hit on some of those examples, talking about how people in earlier instances of church history responded to their neighbor during times of a pandemic. If you're healthy and know someone who can't get access to essential services like the grocery store, the bank, maybe someone who's in a vulnerable population, has maybe an immune deficiency, or someone that could easily catch the virus, maybe you go get their groceries for them, or maybe help go run errands for them. Something to kind of bring some normalcy and some comfort to them. Or maybe if they're sick, you kind of help care for them. It doesn't have to be coronavirus. Maybe it's just the flu or the cold or whatever. Maybe you just make yourself more available now that you've got some time on your hands. Now that you've maybe got some more time also, maybe you take the time to call and check in on family members or friends you haven't talked to in a while. That's a form of almsgiving. And of course, the church still needs help during this time financially. There's all kinds of great charities that are out there. I like Cross Catholic Outreach. That's one Jessica and I give to pretty regularly. So maybe we do some more almsgiving because I know they're addressing people that are suffering from the virus right now too. So again, we can use this opportunity to start building some more spiritual habits, and these are good things. Don't consume yourself with the media drama. I know that seems like a natural reaction to stay informed with what's going on with the virus, how many are getting infected, how many are dying, how many in our area, our state. But instead, use this time to carve out more space for God. See this time as a gift instead of a burden. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, our lives are all being disrupted by this thing. But instead of just taking a negative attitude toward it and seeing it as burdensome, cumbersome, look at it as a blessing to maybe turn back to God. Maybe we can look at it from that angle instead. And again, looking to see how we can bring the good out of a bad situation. And maybe God is using this time for us to do so. Maybe He's using in His divine providence this time to pull more good out of us, to push more good into us, to strengthen our relationship with Him, with our neighbor. I think that's, to me, that's how I'm approaching it. It could be super beneficial. Okay, so again, you can't go to Mass, you can't go to confession, you can't receive the Holy Eucharist. What do we do? Again, I'm going to turn on Aquinas here. Make sure I've got the right one. And it's this theology of spiritual communion. Some of you have probably heard about a spiritual communion. It's not the same as the actual physical reception of the sacrament, but there is still great grace to be had there in this. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to just really kind of summarize it pretty quickly. But St. Thomas Aquinas, back in the Summa, Tertia Pars, the third part of the Summa. Really, it's the fourth part, but it's called the Tertia Pars. Question 80, Article 2, of the use or receiving of this sacrament. He's talking about the sacrament of the Eucharist, but he talks about sacraments in general. This sacrament in general, the Eucharist, is how it can be received. And he sums up there are two ways it can be received: physically, obviously, a physical reception, but also the sacrament can be received by necessity of desire too. If you were well catechized, maybe if you went to Catholic school or RCIA, you've probably heard of this kind of the baptism by desire. Well, there's also a reception of the Eucharist by desire too, and that's really the whole kind of theology behind a spiritual communion. If you are internally disposed to really receive it, and you're approaching it because you're being deprived of it, say, God, you can experience great grace by just reaching out to God and saying, I cannot receive you sacramentally now, but come at least spiritually into my heart. There's the great prayer, St. Alphonsus Liguori, that maybe some of us are used to for spiritual communion. Look that up. It's a very powerful prayer, and it's also something St. Padre Pio used to do all the time. St. Padre Pio did Mass every day, but multiple times during the day, he would just stop and he would pray a spiritual communion. Or if he was in the church, he would go up to the tabernacle and press his heart up against the tabernacle and pray a spiritual communion. There's some great spiritual benefit there. Better to do it than not, especially if you can't receive the Eucharist. But again, these spiritual communions can help dispose us better for the actual reception of the sacrament. St. John Vianney used to say that a spiritual communion would be like blowing the embers in a fire. Kind of heats them back up, heats the coals back up, get the fire back going. And a spiritual communion was like that. You've probably received the sacrament already in your life. Spiritual communion can help bring those embers back to life. So again, especially if you are in this state of deprivation, maybe it's because of mortal sin, maybe it's, of course it's in the situation you're in right now, of not being able to go to Mass, not the frequent reception. Maybe think of just the spiritual communion as having breathing and keeping those embers of flame in your soul. Saint Clare of Assisi, at the end of her life, had a great miracle happen to her. And I'm going to tie it into just maybe some of the other things and kind of weave this back into the spiritual communion piece, and I'll probably end there. But a great miracle happened to her. It's a reason why Pope Pius XII back in 1957 made St. Clare of Assisi, a 13th century saint, the patroness of television. Okay? So when St. Clare was at the end of her life, she was incredibly sick, was bedridden. She lived a life of very austere poverty. Of course, she's the foundress of the Poor Clares, that Franciscan leg of the order, and she couldn't go to Mass because she was so bedridden. But this miracle happened to her where the Mass, as it was being said in the church nearby, almost like appeared to her like a screen in front of her from her deathbed. And so she could experience the Mass, she could see the Mass being said in her room, as if it were like a television. So kind of taking that example there, Pope Pius XII made her the patroness of television. And so she experienced a spiritual communion. She couldn't physically receive the sacrament, but she had this vision of seeing the Mass being celebrated in her room. And in the modern age now, we've got all these great resources at our disposal. Of course, many churches parishes, dioceses, all these other different apostolates out there are offering the Mass virtually, okay? Recordings of the daily Mass, the Sunday Mass, of course, EWTN. That's one my family and I do. You can experience the spiritual communion by watching the Mass at home. Again, it's not the same thing, but there are great graces there in doing a spiritual communion from watching the Mass from your television or your smartphone or your computer. It may seem very surreal and kind of off-putting to some of you, but try it. Again, it's better to do it than not, than just kind of be watching MSNBC or Fox or other mainstream media and worrying about what's going on with the coronavirus. Watch the Mass instead, or just do the daily Mass readings and do a spiritual communion that way. So there's so many resources again at your disposal here to do that spiritual communion. So again, I'll close there. So kind of moving on, I hit on quite a lot this evening. I really went over the time that I allotted for myself. I apologize for that. So if you're watching this video for the past 50 minutes or so and being like, okay, where's he going with all this? I hope I kind of wrapped it up as best as I could for you. So again, take some time. This is just a Lenten reflection on the crisis we're experiencing right now. But up your Lenten game, reflect on what the church has already been through, the different pandemics and plagues and whatnot, and then the spiritual communion piece. Just think about all those things as we, and don't beat yourself up about the fact we can't go to Mass. You know, hopefully you're not like, woo, we don't have to go to Mass. You know, it's, we should be still feeling some sorrow and some deprivation for not being able to do so. But there's goodness we can draw out of that. So that's my reflection for today. In the future, if this kind of quarantine and this social distancing continues, I think we will try and bring the Theology on Tap program back, but do so in a virtual environment, i.e. through webinars. So if you're interested in that, let me know. Let the community know. Father Tony, Susan Kroll. If you see me, just directly give me some feedback if that's something you might be interested in doing. I'm putting everything together to launch it. So again, if this continues, Theology on Tap will continue. It just might be through a virtual format. And maybe if you're interested in some other things out there, I may just provide some other resources. Institute of Catholic Culture, go there. They do webinars, free videos all the time. Way better speakers, people way smarter than me, way holier than me, that are just putting all kinds of great stuff out there. Go to instituteforcatholicculture.com. That's my plug for them. I use them all the time. Great resource. It's free. Just hundreds and hundreds of hours of video and audio to help benefit you in your spiritual life. And they're just going to start doing a Lectio Divina series on some of the gospel readings for the rest of the Lenten season. So again, that's one I highly, highly encourage, aside from maybe going to a virtual Theology on Tap here within the St. Michael's Catholic community here in Fort Bragg. So again, just hang in there, pray, continue to pray, up your Lenten game, and just don't despair. I think we're all going to get through this well. God willing, this doesn't get worse than it is right now. It might, but don't lose hope. There's so much good that again we can draw out of this situation. So again, blessings to you all. Hopefully we'll be doing some more of these, but I hope you have a holy, blessed Lent and a holy and blessed Easter season in a couple weeks. Tomorrow's Laetare Sunday. Do the Mass readings, watch Mass on TV, do that spiritual communion. I think that's one of the best things you can do. And then to spend the rest of the day really honoring the Sabbath, during this Lent season and take on some more spiritual practice. God love you. Take care. God bless. Bye.